Welcome, everybody. It's been a while since I've been on Zoom, so bear with me. I'm going to wait just a couple minutes till we get a few more people. Looks like there might be some in the waiting room, so give me just a second. And okay, and just for good measure, you don't have to leave it on, but if you could all momentarily turn on your camera and give me a wave so I know I'm talking to real people. Get to know who you. Hello, there you all are. Okay, nice to meet you all. So mostly today I'm going to be on a screen share, going through some of the. First of all, can you hear me? Thumbs up if you can hear me. All right. So I intended to do one of these for the first unit, but I think there's a lot of crossover from your history classes, so I wasn't too worried about it. But now we're getting into some stuff that I think you're definitely going to want to, have a little guidance with. And so basically, let me see if I can get the screen share started here. Okay, looking at Canvas here. Can y'all see that? Okay, so what I want to do, and by the way, this will be something I'll do probably most units, with the exception of when I'm traveling. Unfortunately, I'm going to be on the road Thursday all day, and then half the day on Friday. So I'll be going to Florida. I'll have full internet access once I'm there, and we'll be able to do sessions and so forth. And then the following Thursday and Friday as well. So just prepare for that. Anyway, I'll try to schedule so that basically we can go over some of these questions, because we're getting into some stuff that I think most of you probably haven't had in your other classes. So before I start, do any of you have any questions that you would like to specifically go over? You can just type it in the chat, or you can, see if your microphone works. By the way, I'm Mr. Stone. Hi, nice to meet you all. So, okay, if there's no questions, I'm going to start in. I think what I'm going to do, looking at the course modules, is we've got Federalist 10, Brutus 1, Federalist 51. You've got, and then the questions for Unit 1.2, which is basically federalism stuff. So basically, this is kind of what I do in my live classes, is I just kind of go over the questions, and it's not like I'm giving you the answers, but I'm kind of a quasi lecture guy during the school year. So we'll kind of go quickly and pause if you have questions. But I think that's probably the best way to proceed. So let's start with first of all, this whole concept of the Federalist Papers. And by the way, a little plug for the materials. Did you all receive the materials that I sent you through the PDF file? Okay, that is like the golden ticket, not to but I really do think, I'm going to show you what I'm talking about here. Give me one second. Okay. So this is the big packet that I think you're going to find most useful. And I want to just show you a couple of features of it here. In the process of getting it fully interactive for online, but it does have a index. And just to give you some things that you can look at here, there's a College Board outline, which is literally the College Board outline. And then there are unit summaries. So Unit 1 is all here. And this is stuff that I wrote. It may or may not correspond exactly with what your materials are in KVS, but it's what you need to know. It is like cut to the chase, what you need to know. We'll be using that today as we go over some of these questions. And then at the end, I want to show you a couple of things at the end of this packet too. This is really, really helpful. If you ever get confused about all the readings, there's a quick reference guide that tells you, like in 1 or 2 sentences, what each of these things is about. And honest to God, I wish this wasn't the case, but if you remember what's on this page, you will get and can articulate it properly with examples and stuff. That you'll get a 5 on the AP exam. This is what you need to know. And there's a section for the Constitution. There's a section for how to answer these concept applications questions, which we'll get into later. And this is a practice rubric once we get into the argumentative essay questions. And then this is super helpful, a quick reference chart for what the Congress can do, what the president can do. And this is more getting into Unit 2 and stuff like that. But just for now, just be aware that it's there. Okay. All right. Let's see a question. Oh, just answered the question. All right. All right. So let's go back to the questions that you guys have. And basically what I'm going to do is just go through and answer them. If that sounds reasonable. All right. So let me give you the big picture. First of all, the Federalist Papers were all about selling the population on trying this new constitution. Okay. And welcome to those of you just joining. Sorry, I got a few people in the waiting room. So what it was basically a sales pitch for what would become the Constitution. And of all of the Federalist Papers, it is probably the most important. Can you all see that you should be looking at Federalist 10? Yep. Okay. Federalist 10 is kind of the glue that holds the whole course together. Quite honestly, it is so fundamentally important. And I want to just kind of talk generally about it, and then we'll go through these questions. Okay, so Federalist 10, basically Madison is addressing how do you govern this huge country? Because if you've studied up on the Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at governance was based on their negative experience with a strong centralized government. Okay, so they knew they didn't want that. So the Articles of Confederation, as you should have learned by now, is a total disaster. It was all the powers that were needed were at the state level, not at the national level. So the national government was really unable to do pretty much anything. So Federalist 10 is a document that was selling the idea of, how do you deal with this idea of faction? Faction is political disagreement. Okay. And here's the thing. The big picture with Federalist 10 is that Madison believed that faction is unavoidable. It's a function of freedom. Okay. If you live in a free society, people are going to disagree. By the way, this is really important stuff, even if it's outside of the specific notes. Okay. So just kind of focus on the general topic here real quick. And given that people are going to disagree, and it's a huge diversity of people, you have to have some mechanism. And the mechanism that Madison decides upon is a Republican principle. A republic is a system of government where you have elected leaders from all over the country. And periodically, and very importantly, you have frequent elections. And those elections give people an opportunity to change their government without resorting to violent bloodshed and all that. Okay. So, according to Madison, cite the specific causes and concerns of factions. The biggest one that Madison talks about is the unequal distribution of property. Oh, that's another thing I wanted to mention, by the way. Real quick, pause the screen share, go to another one. Bear with me for 1 second. The other document that I think is really important is this required reading packet. This, in my opinion, is significantly better than what you're given in KVS, because KVS is a bunch of links and some of them work, some of them don't. They're just, this has everything in a hard copy. If my in-person students get a hard copy of this, I would, I've given an interactive table of contents. So if you want to skip to Federalist 10, you can just, should be able to, I don't know the right version. Oops. Anyway, do a search. Sorry. I spelled it wrong. That's why. No, this is not working. Anyway, let's just scroll to it. Bear with me for a second. Anyway, it's all in there. And I think the version you have does have a, can you all see that? It says Federalist 10. Okay. It's just a cleaner presentation of it. And it's, numbered paragraphs and stuff. So it's a lot easier to reference, in my opinion. But anyway. Okay. So going back to the questions. Okay. a specific cause of faction, unequal distribution of property. So one function of this idea of, Madison gets, if you read it, it gets into this idea that people are different and have different abilities, and those different abilities result in different allocations of property based on, it's like not everybody can be a brain surgeon, for example. Okay. Y'all should be seeing Federalist 10 right now. Is that what you're seeing? Okay. And so, if you're capable of doing that, you're probably going to make more money than somebody who can only do manual labor. Okay. And so that, of course, causes jealousies and stuff like that. And historically, that's what's caused, faction. Okay. So, of course, so to answer the question, the specific cause of faction is unequal distribution of property. That's the short answer. How does the existence of faction undermine lawmaking? Well, when you have people that disagree and that are pursuing different policies, it makes it difficult. So how do you know, one side wants one thing and one side wants another. And so that makes it difficult to pass laws. Majority factions, why are they more dangerous to democracy than minority factions? Because majority factions, if they hold power and keep power, they can basically do so at, regardless of what the minority faction wants, and that continually enacting policies that are to the detriment of the minority faction is one of the major causes of, for lack of a better term, violence. In other words, the political division that we have today is look what we do. And I always talk about this in my classroom. We had Donald Trump as president. Now we have someone of the exact opposite philosophy. Prior to that, we had a Democrat. Prior to that, we had a Republican. That's very common. That's the way it's supposed to work. It's not always fun to have that division, but that is how you keep one side from accumulating power permanently. Pure democracies, for question 4, Madison considers dangerous because you're going to have just the raw numbers of people. Like, for example, if we let pure majority run this country, just speaking truthfully, the Democratic Party would win almost every election. And some of you may think, well, that's good. Well, not if you're on the other side of that. So, because the numbers, if you look at most major metropolitan areas. Anyway, so pure democracy enables this raw exercise of power without paying attention to the minority view. That's the most important thing to understand. A republic inhibits the effects of factions because it divides power, and especially in what Madison referred to as the compound republic of the United States, where you have not only different regions represented, but you have national government and state government, and they cannot achieve anything unless they're working together at some level. So, but again, one of the most important features of a republic is frequent recurring elections. So make sure that you talk about recurring elections. Our government's efforts to regulate a group's behavior and infringement on an individual group or freedom. I didn't write this question, I'll be honest with you. So no freedom is absolute. I think in any country, we'll study that later on, talk about free speech and stuff like that. There's always limits. So regulating group behaviors, is it an infringement on freedom? Well, every election cycle, there's an opportunity for the other side to exercise power. And that's, again, the most important thing to understand. And by the way, I have some YouTube videos I'll share that with you later on, where I discuss this more coherently than me, on the fly here. But anyway, okay, let us move on to Brutus 1, because here's the thing about Brutus 1. Brutus 1 believed exactly the opposite of what was expressed in Federalist 10. And by the way, before I get onto that topic, let me pause for a moment. And some of my favorite excerpts from Federalist 10, I just want to share with you real quick before we move on from that topic. Madison talks about how you can cure the mischief of faction. And he gives 2 options: 1, by removing its causes, or 2, by controlling its effects. Okay. 2 methods of removing the cause of faction. Well, what's the cause of faction? Well, Madison believes that in a free society, you're going to have faction. So you can take away that freedom, which some countries do, and then you don't have faction. Okay. North Korea doesn't have a dissenting faction because, I could be wrong about this, but they don't tolerate it. And you could end up in jail or worse because you're not allowed to dissent because they don't have freedom like we do. Or by giving to every citizen in the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. So the other way of removing the cause of faction is what today we would call propaganda. And, some groups try to do that. When talking about censorship and stuff like that, those are attempts to try to stifle one point of view. Madison rejects those. Very important to understand. He rejects those. You can't get rid of faction. So the best thing to do is control its effects. And that's what Madison's talking about here. And this is one of my favorite quotes. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an element without which it instantly expires. It could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life because it imparts to fire its destructive agency. You got to love that writing. What he's basically saying there is, you can get rid of faction, but then you get rid of freedom. And, that's obviously undesirable. And then just real quick, Madison's quotable on democracy, which is always kind of surprising to some people. I can find it here. Okay. Paragraph 13, from this view of the subject, it may be concluded that a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit no cure for the mischief of faction. A common impulse or passion will in almost every case be felt by a majority of the whole. The communication and concert result from the form of government itself. And there is nothing, this is important, there is nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party or an obnoxious individual. Hence it is such that democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. So I think that is the big revelation that a lot of people are initially confused by. It's like, wait, it's talking about democracy is a bad thing. Yeah, pure democracy, Madison thinks, is bad. Because in a pure democracy, you have the possibility of one side gaining permanent power to the detriment of somebody else. And Madison rejects that. That's why a republic gives everybody the opportunity on a recurring basis to change if they don't like the way things are going. Okay, going back to the questions. Can everybody see that? Brutus 1, okay. Why does Brutus warn against giving, and by the way, Brutus 1, the symbolism is important. Brutus was the one who, killed the tyrant, stabbed Caesar or whatever. So Brutus 1 is commonly known as the anti-Federalist papers. Okay, so here we go. Why does Brutus warn against giving up power to a strong central government? Well, Madison believes that a strong central government is going to accumulate power, abuse that power to the detriment of everyone else. And again, the experience with the British was fresh in most people's minds at that time period, and that made a lot of sense to a lot of people. And I'm going to just talk about a couple things. I don't see any of the questions set here, but for exam purposes, when you guys take the AP exam, there's something very important to know about what Brutus 1 was complaining about. This is the Constitution. And in the Constitution, there are two provisions in particular that the author of Brutus 1 went ballistic over. And one of them is in the powers of Congress. Section 8 of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 has the powers of Congress. And by the way, if you ever need a cheat sheet on what was wrong with the Articles of Confederation, here it is. These are all of the powers that were deprived under the Articles, and they're all specifically granted to the federal government in the Constitution. But the one power at the end, which was very alarming for the author of Brutus 1, was Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. That provision right there was setting off alarm bells if you're someone who fears centralized power. And to make it worse, it's kind of skipping ahead to one of the next questions here. Article 6 says this Constitution and the laws of the United States should be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made shall be the supreme law of the land. So not only is Congress granted this expansive power in the necessary and proper clause to make all laws, but when it does so, they are superior to whatever the states are doing. And so that's a pretty important thing to make a note of. Okay, let's finish out these questions here. Okay, so what is can a large republic based on the principle of consent of the government sufficiently protect the rights and liberties of citizens, or is a confederation the only? Okay, so I would say obviously, but you guys are learning this for the first time. Brutus I was a proponent of a confederacy. Brutus I did not believe. The author of Brutus I didn't. I think it was Robert Gates or something like that. I don't know, anyway, whoever wrote it was of the opinion that a large republic could not possibly work because there are simply too many people and they're too diverse. There are too many people with too many interests, and Brutus I was of the opinion that only a small republic would work. So a confederation keeps power with the states, which is what Gates was advocating for, the author of Brutus I. How does Article 6 take power away from the states? Well, Article 6 is what I just showed you, which was the supremacy clause, which states that Congress shall make all, the laws of the United States and this Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. And that phrase, supreme law of the land, explicitly supersedes state law. And so it takes away the ability of the power. It takes away the ability of states to control anything the federal government decides to control. Okay, how does the $1 trillion debt reflect the fears of Brutus? Well, wow, when was this written? How about a $30 trillion debt? We have more debt. We have a $1 trillion deficit. Actually, we have a multi-trillion-dollar deficit, sadly, with the aftermath of COVID and all that. But this is case in point. You have an out of control spending. We went from owing, which is still a huge, kind of dating myself here, but the Bush administration was in the early 2000s. Okay, not even, just a little over 20 years ago. The national debt at that time was like $3 trillion, $4 trillion. Now it's 10 times that. So this is, of course, eventually going to cause, it's already starting to cause problems. The inflation that we're seeing today is a result of that. And it's because the federal government has too much power. That's what Brutus would say. Brutus argues that in a republic, the manner, sentiments of the people should be similar. If not, there will be a constant clashing of opinions. Representatives of one part will be constantly striving against the other. Should a republic be made of a small group of like-minded people, or is diversity of opinion beneficial to the success of a federal government? Okay, so this is kind of, I don't know if they're trying to get what Brutus would say, that a republic should be made of like-minded people. And Madison would counter that the diversity of opinion is normal, and trying to pretend like you can control the way people think about politics and stuff like that is not consistent with principles of freedom and individualism and stuff like that. Okay, and if you want some quotations from the reading, they're in there. And again, because I can leave that to you guys, but there's definitely a lot of discussion. I'll skip over to my materials real quick. A dog running loose somewhere. Okay. Okay, so here is Brutus I. Skip ahead to that. Brutus 51. Okay. Just a couple of things from Brutus I, if you need some quotations to pull from. This government possess absolute and uncontrollable power, legislative, executive, and judicial. So paragraph 8 is where he kind of gets into what's wrong with that. And again, these are my numbered paragraphs, so I would encourage you to use what I've given you, not so much what's linked in KVS, just because I think it's easier to reference stuff. So anyway, and then let me get to some of this other stuff here. Here we go. Paragraph 15. History furnishes no example of a free republic anything like the extent of the United States. The Grecian republics were of small extent. So are the Romans. Both of these, in process of time, expanded their conquests over large territories, and the consequence was their governments were changed from that of free republics to that of the most tyrannical to ever exist. That is a quotable paragraph that would be suitable for this question, by the way. And then it kind of expands on that in paragraph 17, 18, 19. So, and again, these are paragraphs different from what you have in KVS, I understand, but again, hopefully you can use that PDF file I gave you. Okay, questions so far? I will look at the chat, and looks like we're doing okay so far. Make sense? Okay. Well, let me go back to the questions. All right, so that knocks out 2 of them. We got, what else we got? Federalist 51. Okay, so Federalist 51 is, and this is what, let me real quickly go back to the required reading list for this course. And I want to give you a memory device that I think is going to really help you guys. Okay. The Federalist papers that you have to know are Federalist 10, which is the whole idea of the Constitution and the whole idea of republicanism. Okay. Federalist 10 and Brutus 1 should be read together. They're kind of opposite. And then we have Federalist 51, Federalist 70, Federalist 78. So if you can just remember the numbers, here's a little secret, okay? Federalist 51 is all about justifying what is Article 1 of the Constitution, Article 1, which is basically checks and balances, Congress, the House and Senate, okay? The lawmaking process and all the checks and balances in that, veto power, things like that. Federalist 70 is all about Article 2. Article 2 is about the presidency. Federalist 78 is about the judiciary. So they go in order, 1, 2, and 3. Federalist 51, Article 1, Federalist 70, Article 2, Federalist 78, Article 3. That is going to demystify, hopefully, what otherwise is kind of this confusing collection of, it's really very simple. The Federalist 10 is the basic justification for republicanism, okay? A government with elected representatives with recurring elections. Sorry about that. Got a mic stand here. Occasionally I hit the spring. Federalist 51 is about the basic bicameral structure of our legislature. Federalist 70 is about the presidency. Federalist 78 is about the courts. Okay, so just FYI. Okay, let us now look at Federalist 51. So we can get this to work this time. There we go. Okay. Federalist 51 establishes bicameralism and some really important things that I want to point out. And this is a quotable from there, by the way. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, are you seeing this? The screen share? Okay. Neither internal controls on government, external nor internal controls will be necessary. In framing a government, which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and then in the next place, oblige it to control itself. Okay, so that is the big, introductory concept with this one. Okay, paragraph 7 for my in-person classes, I make a big production. This is one of the most important sections of Federalist 51. And by the way, my version is extremely abbreviated. So I've kind of cut out all the unnecessary stuff and given you just the stuff that you need to know. So that's another reason why I would use this PDF file. Okay. In Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. The remedy for this inconvenience is to divide the legislature into two houses. So that is a limitation on power. You divide Congress in order to limit its power. And we see that happening before our very eyes with the Biden administration and trying to get various things done. They can't get the most controversial things done that they want to do because they don't have enough votes. Because while the House is going to give them everything they want, the Senate has got a couple of dissenters, and that's by design. And some people are bothered by that because, oh, we're never getting anything done. Well, here's a little secret, okay? The whole point of the Federalist Papers, the whole point of the Constitution and dividing power and having checks and balances is to force compromise, to accommodate different viewpoints and force compromise. And, you know, skipping ahead to Unit 5, which when we get into political parties and all that stuff, we're going to learn that a lot of people forget that. They don't want to do the hard work of compromising. They just want to do what they want to do, regardless of what the other party wants. It's kind of like, we won, so we're going to do what we want, and, to heck with everyone else. That is not the way our country was supposed to work. So we got a lot of reasons why that's happening now. But anyway, this is a really important thing, though, because the legislature predominates. That's because that's the people. That's the voice of the people. But paragraph 8 is the weight of the legislative authority requires it should thus be divided. The weakness of the executive may require that it be fortified. So the president is given the power to veto. And then we talk about the compound Republic of America. That's a reference to federalism. So a double security rises to the rights of the people. You have your state governments, your local governments, but you also have this national government. And the national government can do certain things, and the state governments can do certain things. But all in all, let's look at this paragraph 12. In the Federal Republic of the United States, while all authority in it will be derived from and dependent upon the society itself will be broken into so many parts. Interests, classes, citizens of the rights of individuals or of the minority will be in little danger from interested combinations of the majority. So that's some echoes of arguments in Federalist 10. Okay, and then he also talks about the importance of civil rights and stuff like that. So let's go back to the questions and knock those out and keep on trucking. Here we go. Okay. Federalist 51, why will judicial branch officials remain independent even though they're appointed by the executive and the legislature? Okay, the answer to that is that they have life terms. Okay. Sorry, making sure there's no one in the waiting room. Okay, so they have life terms. Their salaries are protected constitutionally. Okay. And by the way, let's take a look at that in the actual Constitution. So here is the Constitution, and Article 3, remember, is the courts. So here's Article 3. Judicial power shall be vested in one Supreme Court and such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The judges both of the Supreme and inferior court shall hold their offices during good behavior. That means for life. And shall at times receive for their services a compensation which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office. So that's another thing that's really important. We talk in my live classes about the single most important power that Congress has is the power of the purse. They control the spending, but they cannot use that power to go against judges. And by the way, for what it's worth, I don't know if you're paying attention. Any day now, we should have a decision on whether Roe versus Wade is going to be overturned or not. Something happened over in the month of May that has never happened in our history, and that is that somebody leaked an opinion from the Supreme Court. The reason that never happens is because that is essential to the sanctity of the court's decision-making process. They don't want to be subject to the political pressures of outsiders. The whole point of the courts is that they're insulated and they can make decisions based on, what their intellect tells them is the right thing to do based on their experience and things like that. So just FYI, a little bit of current events there. That's something that is just really, it's an attack on the court, and it just speaks to my dog. speaks to the controversy regarding that opinion, obviously, as to why it happened. But still, it's an attempt to influence what apparently would be a majority of the court overturning Roe, which we'll see if they stick to it or not. But anyway, okay. So again, they will remain independent. Their salaries are protected and they serve life terms. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels, blah, blah, blah. We already with this. What is Madison's solution for the government to control itself? Okay, divide Congress. Fortify the executive by giving a veto power. In other words, short answer, checks and balances. Okay. And by the way, for these questions, in general, you don't have to write long, tortured responses. You should come from your own, efforts, not cut and paste from something you saw somewhere else. I mean, obviously, but a short, succinct answer is fine for my purposes. I don't need to, as long as you understand it. Okay. What does keeping constituent parts in their proper places mean or refer to, and what is the purpose and means of accomplishing this goal? Okay, so for lack of a better term, that means, to use a modern expression, stay in your lane. Okay. Congress deals with legislation. The president deals with administration, administering law. The courts deal with interpretation. And so what's the purpose and means of accomplishing this goal? Again, checks and balances. You give each branch some control over the other. Congress passes laws. The president can veto those laws. Congress can override the veto. The courts can come in and declare something unconstitutional. Congress can propose a constitutional amendment and supersede that, or the states can do that. So there's lots and lots of ways to keep those checks and balances from, in place. When the rights of the minority are not protected, what eventually happens to the government? Okay, so this goes back to, again, echoes of Federalist 10. When the minority, and by the way, don't think about ethnic minorities, we're talking about numerical minorities. Okay, when the rights of the minority are not protected, eventually this is what leads to what Madison would call the violence of faction, whether that's physical violence or just, political discontent, riots in the streets, things like that. That's what happens. And that's why you have all of these checks on government. That's why we have recurring elections. How are the powers of the legislative branch to be balanced against the weaker executive branch? Once again, with the veto power given to the president. What features of the new Constitution doubly protect the rights of the people? This is a reference to federalism. Okay. If we go to Article 4 of the Constitution, which is the next one, this is basically states' relations and things like that. And, the fact that we have a federal system where we have state power and national power. Lost track of my screen share. There we go. And by the way, not to stray from the question here, but again, the features of the new Constitution that doubly protect the rights of the people, the fact that the states have power, and also we have the 10th Amendment, where power is not delegated to the United States or reserved to the states. Now, there's a line that you're going to come across eventually in this course where they talk about multiple stakeholders, multiple access points, I should say, for stakeholders. Okay, so stakeholders are people that have an interest in policy, and multiple access points means there are lots of different ways to get power to get a policy enacted. Okay, so let's just think of some basic ones. All right, and you're going to come up with this. You're going to see this later on in the course. But let's say you want, figure out whatever policy it is you want changed. Okay, you want some new environmental regulation. Okay, well, one thing, you can write your congressman and maybe get a law started that way. So you have your representatives, or as we're going to learn in this next unit, we also have a bureaucratic agency already dedicated to protecting the environment called the EPA. So you could, if you're an interest group, maybe put pressure on the EPA to establish a new environmental rule. That's an access point. You could file a lawsuit. That's an access point. You could go to your local representatives, your state representatives. That's an access point. So in a system of federalism, which is what this part of the course is about, you have all of these avenues for making policy. And that's, of course, by design. Okay, let's go to the final set of questions. Any questions so far? Don't be afraid to speak up and, alrighty then, let's go to the final set of questions, which would be questions for 1.2. All right, here we go. And by the way, I'm not encouraging you to just wait for these review sessions and answer all these questions, but you can. I would if I, it's, I don't think it's wrong to help you out with this stuff and make it a little easier on you. Anyway, explain how Article 5 of the Constitution reflects federalism. Okay, Article 5 is a must-know portion of the Constitution. Article 5 is the amendment process for the Constitution. So going back to the Constitution, again, here's Article 5. Congress, whenever 2/3 of the House and Senate, or House and Senate shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to the Constitution, or, and this is really, really important, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states. Okay. Now, let me be emphatic for a moment. Okay. Article 5 has a process for amending the Constitution. This is the second method of amending the Constitution where the states can hold conventions. And if 2/3 of them get together, hold a convention, and then propose an amendment, and 3/4 of the states ratify, they can change the Constitution. They can completely revise the Constitution without any input whatsoever from the federal government. Now, there's never been an amendment done that way. It's always with Congress, 2/3 of Congress proposing an amendment. But the fact that that is one of the options in Article 5 speaks to the power that the Anti-Federalists had and the demands that they had because they were afraid of an overpowering national government. So just be aware that that portion of Article 5 is pretty darn important. Okay, describe how separation of powers and checks and balances allow for multiple access points. There's that question. Okay, just went over that. Just how the separation of powers and checks and balances allow for multiple access points for various groups to influence policy. Okay, once again, I'll use my favorite example in my classroom. Okay, let's say that you just experienced a horrible, I don't want to get too dark. Okay, let's say that you had a almost catastrophic experience backing out your car because little kids were playing in the driveway. Okay, and you just didn't see them. And so you hear of this new technology, and of course, this has all come to fruition. We have what's called a backup camera. Okay, but let's say that you just feel very strongly that now that this technology is there, every car ought to have a backup camera. Okay, well, okay, option one, you can write your congressman. Probably not going to get any action. Option two, if you're someone with some importance, maybe maybe you form an interest group. Maybe you put together a video that goes viral, and all of a sudden, people are talking about it. And now it's like, well, wait a minute, why aren't we requiring this in cars? Okay, so option two would be to put pressure. That's called lobbying members of Congress. Okay, that's called outsider lobbying, by the way, if you're interested. Or let's say that you maybe want to make it a state law. You could go to your state legislatures, or anyway, point being, or if the president wants to do something about it, he could go through a bureaucratic agency, the National Transportation Safety Board, or whatever it is. The point is, there's lots of ways to get that policy enacted. So that's what we mean by multiple access points: state level, local level, national. All three branches of government, even outside influence with lobbying efforts and stuff like that. And by the way, if you use a term like lobbying, you need to make sure you define what it is. Lobbying is when people, whether it's groups or corporations or individuals, put pressure on policymakers to do something. They lobby for change. Okay. And the word is originated from, in the old days before modern telecommunications, you got the ear of your member of Congress by literally going to Washington, D.C. in the lobby of Congress and hanging out. And I assume that's where the term came from. But anyway. Okay. Compare and contrast Federalist 10 and Brutus 1. I think we already did that, but I'm going to give you a little peek at something very useful in the materials that I gave you. Just so happens that if you go to the comprehensive review outline and go to the Unit 1 summary, lo and behold, we have Federalist 10 and Brutus 1, topic 1.3. There's all the answers for you. Okay. So if you want to write them down, we're not going to go over them right now because you can look it up for yourself. But it's all the stuff that we just talked about. You know, Federalist 10, faction is unavoidable, but a large republic will fix it because you give people frequent opportunities to change their government. Brutus 1 believed that a republic would only lead to corruption and abuse of power and an out of control government. And by the way, you know, newsflash, both of these arguments had merit. Brutus 1 was absolutely prophetic in predicting the kind of out of control national government we have now. The $30 trillion ever increasing national debt that we have speaks to that. So, you know, I don't know how you guys studied this in your history class, but a lot of history teachers portray the anti-federalists as the bad guys, and it's not at all the case. I mean, there's just different arguments, you know, but there was absolutely the case that a lot of the arguments were valid. Okay. I just saw a new feature of this. I probably should try when I'm not live here, but okay, let's go back to the question set. Define exclusive and concurrent powers and cite how each limits the power of the national and states government. Okay, so in the Constitution, there are certain types of power that are only, let's see if I can get this to work. Nope. Only powers for the national government. Those are called exclusive powers. Okay, so going to the Constitution, in our list of powers, okay. The power to tax is what we call a concurrent power because the national government can do it and the states can do it. So is the power to borrow. The power to regulate commerce among the several states based on a court case, which used to be required, but Gibbons versus Ogden, I think you guys had a question about that. That is an exclusive power of the national government. Okay. So is immigration policy. So is coining money. So is counterfeiting rules, immigration. Okay. Those are all exclusive powers of the national government. Okay. Okay. Concurrent powers are those that both the national and state governments have. Okay. And the most obvious one is the power to borrow, but also the power to prosecute crimes and stuff like that. Almost all crimes are handled at the state level, but there's also federal crimes, obviously tax fraud and stuff like that. Okay. Sorry. Okay, 5, the distribution of power between federal and state governments changes to meet the needs of society. These changes are reflected in grants, incentives, and aid programs. And okay, so this is where we get into the federalism stuff explicitly. Federal revenue sharing mandates, categorical grants, block grants. Okay, I don't know, they always talk about this stuff, but you really don't see too much of that on the AP exam, but there are some programs where there's a state component to the funding and a national component to the funding. Okay, so in those situations, we call it revenue sharing. Most common example of that would be transportation budgets. Okay, the states spend a lot of money on transportation. We also have federal spending. Think about I-10. Okay, I-10 is really interesting on the west side of town because you've got this toll road, which is local in this otherwise federally funded, enormously wide freeway. I don't know if you ever looked at the Katy Freeway, but it's literally the width of a football field. It's absolutely incredible. Mandates are when the federal government requires states to do stuff. And mandates, as we learned through COVID, are sometimes the easy way out, but also very troubling, especially when it comes to mandating individual behavior. But mandates, the most common mandate for the purposes of this course that I will tell you about is the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm going to write that down. The ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, requires that businesses accommodate the handicapped. Okay. If you've ever been to any grocery store, academy, any shopping place, wherever, there's designated handicap spots. There's also ramps. One of the things that I tell my students in the regular semester is that all through the 90s, I grew up in Iowa, went to Iowa State University. They had just passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. And one of the things that it requires is all sidewalks have to have a ramp going to the street to accommodate wheelchairs. Well, curbs were designed to keep cars off the sidewalks, and they weren't thinking about handicap access when the streets in America were originally built. So all throughout the early 90s, you heard constant jackhammering of concrete because they're busting out those curbs and creating ramps that would allow handicapped access. That is a federal mandate. Okay. It's also an unfunded mandate. And occasionally those types of policies are enacted. We saw two mandates under the Biden administration get struck down by the courts. The vaccine mandate and recently the mask mandate was struck down by the courts as overreach on the part of the agencies that issued those rules. And we'll talk more about that later on. But categorical grants versus block grants. You must know the difference between these two. And by the way, going back to my materials, there is a nice little section on that. So just giving you some extra guidance here. Here it is, categorical versus block grants. Can you all see that? Yes, okay. So categorical grants are specific. Think of strings attached on a little puppet or something like that, where the federal government is basically dictating how things are done. Block grants are grants where the states are given more flexibility. So the most common example of block grants would be road construction. Okay, and for this simple reason, all right. How many of you can do a thumbs up or whatever, have lived in Texas most of your life? How many of you are from the north? Okay. What's the white stuff that falls in the wintertime in the north?
Snow.
Snow, yes. And what happens when the snow piles up on the ground? Makes it hard to drive, right? So we have these things in the north called snow plows. And think about what the snow removal budget is for Houston, Texas. I'm going to say 0 because, it doesn't snow very often. And of course, when it does, it's like the apocalypse. So if the federal government was to mandate that every state determine, has like 2% of its transportation budget for snow removal, that wouldn't make very much sense, would it? So rather than try to dictate and micromanage what every state needs, use a block grant. Here's your money for transportation. In the north, they're going to take a bunch of money and buy sand and salt and snow plows and stuff like that. In the north, we build 26-lane freeways, or in the south, or in the Katy area, I guess. I don't know. Also in the Northeast, most people, if you live in New York City, don't own a car. You'd be foolish to have a car. It's too expensive. You got to, you rely on public transportation. So transportation budgets put in the bank. That is the most common example of a block grant. Another example of block grant is welfare reform in the 90s. This is right here. Prior to the 90s, we had food stamps, and I don't know if you've ever seen food stamps or not, but let me see if I can give you a visual here. Back in the day, okay, so food stamps were paper coupons that had a cash value. And so if you had food stamps, you could go into a store, and you know, in the 80s, I'm older than you guys, obviously, but I was, you know, we would, you know, I worked at a grocery store, and you see these people come in with food stamps, and they would pay cash, or they pay, you know, for food stamp, they pay for their groceries with food stamps. And then let's say they had a $50 food stamp and they bought $35 for their groceries, so they give back $15 in cash. So there's a lot of abuse. So in the 90s, states were like, wait a minute, don't we have, like, you know, barcodes? Couldn't we do something more efficient? And so they came up with, today what we have was electronic benefits transfer cards. So, and what happened, and this is kind of an important concept, by the way, going back to the question set, what happened, I just realized I can make this a lot easier on myself. Okay. Is when the federal government cedes control, in other words, they go from categorical grant to block grants, that's called devolution, D-E-V-O-L-U-T-I-O-N, devolution. And that is, I don't know why it's not in the question set, but that's a term you should know. And basically, in the case of welfare, the federal government figured out that the states had a better sense of how to administer it than the national. So they would switch from specific, here's what you got to do with this, to block grants where they say, you guys figure it out. And in fact, there were a lot of efficiencies that were, you know, the states came up with that the federal government didn't. Okay. Balanced power between the national and state governments had changed over time based on Supreme Court decisions. Explain how the following two cases. So these are two cases that are required for this: McCulloch versus Maryland and US v. Lopez. And so let us take a look at that real quick. One more time. I think next time I figured out how to make this all in the same window, so I don't have to keep pausing the screen share. Okay. In your required reading file that I gave you, the cases are all indexed for you. So you should be able to just click on it and it goes right to them there. So here's McCulloch versus Maryland, and the next one is the Lopez case. Okay. I'm going to do these very quickly because you guys can read them on your own. And by the way, I would very, very strongly recommend, and when I say that, I mean that, and I don't mean to take away from the KVS creators and everything like that, but the case summaries in this packet that I've given you guys are so much better and so much easier to understand than a very simplistic, you know, link to the OEA's website or whatever, that or OEA website. That's not, it's just not enough. But anyway, comparing these two cases. Okay. First of all, McCulloch versus Maryland is the anti-federalists' worst nightmare realized. Okay. What were the anti-federalists worried about? They were worried about too much federal power. Well, what does McCulloch versus Maryland do? This should be a holdover from your US history class, so I'll be brief. The question was, can the federal government create a bank? And because they don't have the explicit power, they don't have the express power to do that, but they do have the implied power, says the courts, because it's necessary and proper to create a bank to carry out the power to coining money and regulating its value. So McCulloch versus Maryland is kind of the starting point of this ever expansion, ever-ending expansion of federal power. And going to the questions again. This was a, first of all, the court recognized that implied powers existed, and also that when they are exercised, the supremacy clause kicks in, and then the states cannot, states cannot regulate in that area. United States versus Lopez is kind of the end of that story, where for the first time, the Supreme Court recognized that there's limits to federal power. And this might be a little bit puzzling for some of you guys, given the recent events and stuff like that, which is really tragic, obviously. But in US v. Lopez, the issue, and this is, by the way, this predated Columbine and all the school shootings, which seem to be more and more common, unfortunately. But United States versus Lopez, Congress passed a law that it was called the Federal Gun-Free School Zones Act. And it basically made it a federal crime to carry a gun in a school zone. And most people today would think, well, what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is that Congress doesn't have that power. Most criminal matters are handled by the states and always have been. And for the Congress to come in and say, well, we're going to regulate this too. Well, so here's what happened. Okay. Congress passed this law based on authority under the Commerce Clause. And the Supreme Court was thinking, no, wait a minute, how is this related to commerce? And it's actually kind of comical, the arguments that the United States made. Congress has the authority under the Commerce Clause. This is no different than Heart of Atlanta Motel, which was a case that challenged the Civil Rights Act because, that was based on the Commerce Clause. Well, when you're denying, accommodations to people based on their skin color, that's an interference with commerce. So the court upheld that law. But here, how is possessing a gun related to commerce? And so they make this, although possession of a gun in school is not a direct form of interstate commerce, it can be classified as commerce because the costs associated with violent crime are substantial. The presence of guns near schools negatively affects students' ability to, so they're learning, which will impede their future success and thus affect the economy. So, I don't mean to make light of this, but what they're trying to do is make this connection to commerce. Well, if the kids are afraid of, guns, then they're not going to do well. And so what the court basically says, and this is the Scalia court, Antonin Scalia is a constitutional conservative who's, basically thinks that there's a lot of federal overreach with stuff like that. He's basically saying, look, this is not interstate commerce. You can't, and by the way, important connecting concept here that you need to know. Congress has to have constitutional authority for everything it does. And the constitutional authority that they're trying to hold on to here is this idea that somehow gun possession is related to commerce with regard to this school law. Anyway, the Supreme Court said that's too much. And for the first time in 60 years, the Supreme Court ruled that carrying a gun in a school zone is not economic activity. Congress can only regulate channels of interstate commerce, highways, waterways, people, machines moving in commerce, and economic activities that have a substantial effect on commerce, not using the Commerce Clause to justify any kind of regulation whatsoever. And just one last tip on this before we move on. You're going to see questions about the Commerce Clause. You're going to see questions about which congressional power enables the court to do this or that. Let me get the right thing up here on screen. And if it's a regulatory matter, make a note of this, it's the Commerce Clause. If it's a taxing and spending matter, a stimulus check, a tax cut, building a new highway system based on the power to tax, it's the taxing and spending clause or the borrowing clause. So if it's regulatory in nature, you want a minimum wage, that's a regulation, it's a Commerce Clause. If it's a taxing and spending thing, then it's the power of taxation or borrowing. And we'll go over some questions later on. Okay. I think that takes care of everything in preparation for the exam. Is that correct? Are we there? Okay. Anybody have any questions? Has this been helpful to you guys, you think? Okay, good. All right. Well, I said I would record this, so hopefully, I don't know how it's going to come out. Maybe just the audio or something like that. Probably needs the whole thing. But anyway, but if you have questions and want to stick around for a little bit, you can hang on for a little bit here if you want to talk individually, or you can message me or whatever. Anyway, otherwise, keep in mind, I will not be available all day Thursday and most of the day Friday. So I might take a little longer to answer emails and stuff. If you have an issue with the test, it's almost always something I can fix very easily. So don't panic about stuff like that. But, okay. If there's no other questions, have a good day. We'll see you next time. All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Is it Fatima? Is that how? Are you there?
Yes, sorry. I just had a question on where can I find the comprehensive review sheet?
It went out on email and you should have gotten it. Did you join the class late?
I did not, but is it in the like important information email?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, it should be an attachment. It's a zip file.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Anybody else? All right, I'm signing off.